I spoons for a while. Yep, he like it's him. Right, of course.
So, you did not spoon stuff for a while? I know, visually. Alright then, whew. Hope I can spoon stuff for a while. I'm back.
Whoa. So you didn't know this?
Yes, I was, visually. And I did find something.
Whoa.
Cool, right? If you consume, then we know this.
Whoa. Well, that's kinda cool. I didn't spoon for that. Well, I hope it does, by the way. If I assume. That is kinda cool.
I know, right?
Well, spoons for others. Hello?
Oh, if you consume?
Yes, usually.
Hey, of course.
So it does?
Yep, just gives me a good point.
Right, of course. Well, hope we can spoon for the others. I hope so, visually. Because I'm gonna spoon a lot, visually. You didn't know this?
Yep, it just gives me a good point also. Also, visually.
Right, of course. If you consume?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, I have no idea what they're doing.
Right, of course. If you consume. Whoa.
Well, I was gonna spin about that, visually.
Whoa. So, you hear visually? Yes, just gives me a good point.
Right, of course.
I didn't spoon about that.
I know, he does, visually.
Okay, just gives me a good point also. If you consume.
Yes, I'm gonna spoon stuff for a while.
Right, of course. Before we know this, visually. Because if you consume visually. Because you didn't know this?
Yes.
Right, of course. Because we still miss Connor.
Yep, just gives me a good point.
I know. So, they're here visually?
Yep. Right, of course. Wow. If you consume, by the way. Hello.
Whoa. Well, that's kinda cool. I did not expect you was here.
I know, visually.
Right, of course. Well, I was getting spoons about that, definitely.
Yep, just gives me a good point.
Right, of course. So, you didn't know this?
Yes, just gives me a good point.
Right, of course. Just does, definitely. Because I, said so.
Right, you getting spoons about that?
Yes. If you consume, we're gonna spoons about others. And I have no idea. I'm gonna spoons a lot, visually. Alright, of course. I know! It just gives you a good point, visually. Because I said so.
Right, of course.
I know! It just gives you a good point, visually. Because I said so, and you didn't know this?
Yes, it just gives me a good point, visually.
Right, of course. You didn't know this?
Yes, it just gives me a good point, but others.
Right, of course. So you still here, visually? Yep.
Just gives me a good point, definitely.
Right, of course. I guess it does, definitely. If you consume, then we know this. Because I have no idea, definitely. If you consume,
Yep.
okay. I'm gonna spoon a lot, by the way. I I hope so, Vigilante. Because that's still true, by the way. They may know this. So, you didn't know this?
Yes, I was, Vigilante.
Right, of course. If you can see him, then we know this. How are we gonna know this about this stuff?
Well, I'm gonna splints a lot. Yep.
Okay, it just gives me a good point, Vigilante. Because you, said so?
Yep. Vigilante.
Right, of course. It does, definitely. But if you can assume, how are we gonna know this about this stuff?
Because we have no idea.
Right, of course. This always does, definitely. Are you sure about them?
Yes.
Okay, it just gives you a good point, Vigilante. Then I know this. How am I gonna know this, Vigilante? Right, of course.
I'm gonna splint a lot, by the way. Didn't you know this?
Yes, just gives me a good point also. Whew, I'm gonna spoons a lot differently. If I can assume.
Right, of course. Yep.
If you can assume, by the way, then into this for a bit. Yep, it just gives me a good point, but others. If I can assume.
Right, of course.
I know. Just gives me a good point, but others, usually. If you can assume. Yep. Okay. Whew. I'm gonna spoon spot ours. If I can assume. Well, I was gonna spoon spot that.
I know, Vigilante.
Right, of course. That does definitely. If I can assume. Then under this. Yep. Just gives me a good point, Vigilante. If you can assume, Vigilante.
Right, of course.
It does definitely. If I can assume. Then I know this. Because I said so. And I have no idea. Because I did know this.
Yes?
Okay. Just gives me a good point, Vigilante. Hope we're gonna find errors. I hope so, Vigilante. And I didn't know this. Because if you can assume, Vigilante. And hope we're gonna spoon spot the errors. Because that's still true, by the way. Then we know this. Right, of course. It does definitely. If you can assume, then we know this. Right, of course. That does definitely. I'm gonna spoon some for a while, Vigilante.
You didn't know this?
Yes, just gives me a good point, Vigilante. If we're gonna spoon spot the others, how are we gonna know this?
Okay.
That's supposed to happen, Vigilante. If I can assume, I'm gonna spoon spot the others, but it's still true, definitely. Then we know this. That's supposed to happen, right? If I can assume, by the way. Then that is for a bit. Yep. Just gives me a good point, Vigilante. Because I have no idea how this is supposed to happen. Because you can assume.
Yes?
Okay, I'm gonna spoon staff for a while. If you can assume, Vigilante. Then we're gonna know this. Right, of course. I know, it just gives you a good point, Vigilante. Then we know this. Right, of course. I know, it just gives me a good point, Vigilante. Then you can assume.
Yes?
Right, of course. That does, Vigilante. I'm gonna spoon staff for a while. If you can assume. Then we know this.
Right, of course.
I'm gonna spoon a lot, Vigilante.
Yep.
Okay, whew. I'm gonna spin staff for a while. If I can see him. Right, of course. If I was getting to this, of course.
We have no idea, Vigilante.
Right, of course. It does definitely. If I can see him. Yep.
If you can see him?
Yep.